Welcome, everyone, to our Clean Water Project webinar number 5. I'm Pat Swazi. I'm president of the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds. Before we get started, just a couple things to mention. Just a reminder, if you are not already a member, we hope that you'll consider joining and also donating. Your membership and donations make it possible for us to have these kinds of webinars that are open to the public and free, as well as our many other educational activities that we do throughout the year and our statewide advocacy for Vermont lakes. So if you can help us and support us, we very much appreciate it. Sorry about that. There we go. Just get rid of that. A few logistics before we get started with our presentations. I want to just mention that we are recording this event and we will be posting it on our website within about a week or so. Also, just asking everybody to remain muted during the speaker presentations. We will have time for question and answer after each speaker. So at that point, you can either use the raise hand function in Zoom to be called on, or please feel free to put comments and questions into the chat, and we are monitoring the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dave Johnson, our board treasurer and also our leader on organizing these events, to do the introductions. So Dave.
Yes, thank you, Pat. Yes, thank you all for joining us today in the 5th in the series of webinars we've been having, sponsored by Watershed United Vermont, covering clean water projects with a focus on lake watershed action plans. And the first speaker today is Evan Fitzgerald. He is the founder and principal of Fitzgerald Environmental Associates. Evan and his company have been doing stormwater projects around the state for 20 years and more recently have created watershed action plans for Lake Eden, Lake Elmore, Lake Dunmore, Fern Lake, Lake St. Catherine, and South Hero Island on Lake Champlain. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Shall I take it away?
Please.
Okay. I'm going to go into presentation mode, so I think I won't be able to see anybody once I do that. So if anybody needs to stop me or has questions, just give a shout. Okay, let's see. Here we go. All right. Oops. Can everybody see this full screen here?
Looks
okay,
good.
Good. All right. Well, Dave, you already kind of gave a rundown of where we've been working, but I had this, I think the last 5 laptop talk that my colleague Frank and I gave, we had this list and map going. So I figured I did update it. There are a couple more areas where we've been working. So we put this on the map. Dave gave you a list, and here's a map just showing in green where we've completed some LWAPs, and in red where we're still working. So about 10 areas. Before I so Dave asked me to talk about the design process, as part of the LWAP, and I think following LWAP, because typically when we develop an LWAP, we flesh out what we call conceptual designs, usually for a short list of projects, like 3 to 5 projects. And then what follows after that is if the partners want to move a project forward, we're typically going into a bit more detailed design as part of a separate effort after the LWAP is completed. So what I was going to do today is run through a bunch of project examples where we've done both the 30% concept design as part of the LWAP, as well as taking it forward all the way to implementation. So I'm showing you some photos and examples of how these projects were built and things that we encountered along the way through that whole process. So just as a recap, since Frank and I had these slides from the last talk, I just wanted to show them real quick how we get from, identified projects to the concept designs. Many of you are probably familiar with this, but just a refresher. We do a bunch of field work as part of LWAP, all around the watershed of the lake, generally looking at these 3 areas that are listed here: shorelands, streams, and roadways. A lot of the lakes where you all live and work are, do your improvement work are probably pretty heavily forested in the watershed. So that's like one item that's conspicuously absent, I would say, on this list. Like often the forested areas do contribute sediment, phosphorus to lakes, but there's such a vast area and often in private land. So we generally don't cover those in as much detail as the other 3 areas listed. Once we identify projects, we start evaluating their costs and benefits and different merits. These are just some examples on the screen of kind of outputs from, scoping projects in a little more detail, and then running through what we call a prioritization matrix. That's where we're looking at the water quality benefits of each project and the actual cost. At that point, a pretty preliminary ballpark cost to implement, and looking at some other, things that we weigh with you all as partners in the process of trying to whittle a long list of sites. Sometimes, typically, we got like 20 or 30 project sites that we scout. Sometimes more. I think on Dunmore we had like 40 or 50, and then trying to work with you all as partners to whittle that list down to 3 or 5 sites. That was just a recap I wanted to give of how we get then to the 30% design. So once those projects are picked for 30% design, what we're doing next, and I think the first and most important part to make sure the project is feasible and eligible to move forward, this one's pretty obvious: making sure the landowner is on board. And I would say, public lands are often where we go first. Like a bunch of the examples I'm going to show you are from fish and wildlife access areas or town property. And, they're an obvious partner because, the state or the town are often similarly invested in, clean water as you all are as lake organizations. So, but that's obviously first and most important step. Coordinating with landowners too, to make sure they understand as we flesh out the concept design, what the changes will be and what they can expect, to make sure there's no major concerns about the proposal up front. That's a really important step. And then on our end as designers and engineers, we're looking to collect more data than what we did in the initial scouting, initial site visit. We may be bringing out, gear to actually collect topographic data and elevation data to vet the design further, doing what we call modeling, so runoff modeling, trying to understand how much water is moving around or through the site, and then trying to understand the initial permitting requirements, which Laura DeLugalecki is going to talk about more after me. So what I wanted to do next was just run through a handful of sites where we went from the concept level design to the final design and then implementation. A number of these are from Lake Dunmore and some of the earlier LWAPs that we did like on Lake Eden, because a lot of those projects that are or LWAPs that are a little bit older have, had a little bit more time to advance through the design and implementation process. So this site is the Magoon Boat Access. It's on the west side of Lake Dunmore. It's kind of a long, skinny parking area. As you can see, it's all sloping down toward the water. And again, these boat accesses are great opportunities often because there's gravel surfaces that are pitched toward the lake, and if we're lucky, there's a little bit of green space in between the parking area and the lake to do a little treatment. So that's what we had here. And you see there's a couple of green areas identified. These were later designed for bioretention basins. And honestly, if I flip from this concept design to the final design, you'll see a change from a more colorful illustration to a more sort of bland, grayscale engineering drawing. It really didn't change that much. But of course, we have to flesh out the level of detail and create, what we call contract documents, something that we reference with the contractor, and that, in this case, like Dunmore Fern Lake Association and the contractor and us as engineers overseeing the project can reference and make sure that we're, staying on task. So jumping to the final design, you see, we have the trench drain as was shown on the previous version, the couple bioretention basins, and really not a lot of change, just a lot more detail. We fleshed out how big these basins needed to be, at what elevations, what size trench drain, what did the swale look like on the north side, etc. So here's a few photos of the work shortly after it was completed. And then I think about a year after it was completed when the vegetation was growing in. So, so to jump from that 30% design to final design, you need more survey data to refine those elevations. You need to identify more clearly the resources that might be of concern to the regulatory folks, where the ordinary high water level is on the lake, where wetlands are and their buffer zones, if there are wetlands, that sort of thing. That's one example. Here's another example up in Eden. Again, this is a town property. This is the town beach on the west side of the lake. Here's a concept design that shows a small bioretention basin receiving runoff from a portion of a parking lot and a road. And now jump to the actual design. We see a little bit more detail here with what we call a grading plan. So showing existing versus proposed contours, showing what size pipe for an under drain needs to go in there, what the elevation, the outlet of that pipe should be, how that pipe then is going to tie into the other drainage features nearby. So again, not a big change in the overall scope from the concept design to the final, just more detail. And I think I've got, here's a photo of the site that was built. This is later in the year photo where a lot of the vegetation sort of died down, but this was planted with a bunch of native flowers, and it actually it's a really nice basin. If anyone's from Lake Eden Association, I think this turned out really nicely, and it's a nice beautification of the town property. All right, going back to Lake Dunmore. This is Branberry State Park, again, public property, working with Department of Forests, Parks and Recreation, another willing partner on these state lands. This is a concept design that shows some shoreline restoration, areas that had been experiencing some erosion, and If any of you know Branberry State Park, it's pretty much grass right down to the water in a lot of places. And this design was, or project was intended to allow some of that shoreline area, near shore area, to revegetate and recover. Also, there's an area where on the property where quite a bit of runoff comes from upslope and kind of passed over probably a previous, what was probably wetland one day in the past. And we were trying to restore some of that wetland and retain some water before it kind of went, flowed down to the lake and caused some erosion on the shoreline. So now jumping to the final design, what we had to do here, both for design and permitting, was add some more detail with, you can see on these cross sections here, the ordinary high water mark is defined, and that was important in this case because the Army Corps of Engineers, we needed to get a permit from them for the for the work below that ordinary high water mark. And these plans show some different, basically different configurations of the shoreline, depending on what that slope is and whether there are trees, on the shore and how we were working around that. But each of these treatments involved what we call coir logs. That's these are big coconut fiber logs that are wound together, and they're really resistant to rot, and they can be anchored into that bank area and provide stability. Here's a picture of this work before and after. This is like immediately after the work, and you can see the coir log there anchored into the bank. This was intended to stop this erosion and undermining along these tree roots. And I don't know how well you can see this, but there are little willow stakes sticking out here. These stakes were sort of peppered all along this area, above and below the coir log. And most of these, we checked on this recently, most of these are sprouted and growing pretty well. And I think I'm getting close to the end of my time. And this is the last project I wanted to show. This is now back up at Lake Eden. I wanted to show this one because it's a little different. It's a stream project. So most of the projects I would say that we've helped partners implement have been right down on the lakeshore, like the others that I showed you. This one was a pretty unstable stream, borderline, intermittent, perennial stream. When we talk about streams like the bigger ones that flow year round, we call perennial. This one, this is up on Griggs Road, had a small watershed, 28 acres. But it did, because of the steepness of the contributing area, did receive a lot of runoff certain times of year and had some unstable banks below the town culvert. So we, as part of the final design, we collected data, topographic data along the stream. And again, this is similar to Branberry State Park, where we had some different configurations of banks. We're showing, different sections of the channel that had steep areas and not so steep areas. And also, we implemented what we call grade control. We set some stones in the bottom of the channel to hold the bed of the channel to prevent it from eroding. And here are a couple pictures of the work right after it was completed. You can see there's one of those grade control structures there in the lower right-hand corner, and you can kind of tell, actually, it's from the photo, it's accumulating some sediment there and holding the grade. So with that, just a quick recap of some things that I was thinking about as I went through these projects. I mentioned, public properties are low-hanging fruit in terms of implementation, often willing partners invested in clean water. That's where we've ended up on many implementation projects in the past few years. You know, Dave, I'm sure you can appreciate this, having worked through these. Number two, having conversations early on, with landowners is really important, making sure they understand, what those changes are. And sometimes as much as we explain and show them what we're trying to illustrate, the outcome will be, sometimes landowners need a little extra help seeing that, so that they're not surprised as we move forward into implementation. Another thing regarding funding, I'm sure you're all quite familiar with this. Like, if the project does mitigate phosphorus loading, it may be eligible for clean water service provider funding. There's a lot of that funding available, and those groups are looking to spend it. So if the project isn't very what we call cost effective for phosphorus, there's still other funding sources out there, enhancement grants, and like Champlain Basin Program. And then last thing I just want to point out, it is really important for us as designers and engineers, I think, to see the process through to construction and support the work. This has happened on all these projects, and we're happy to, and I think others, other consultants are happy to be part of that process moving forward, to see it through to completion and sort of give it a stamp of approval at the end. And with that, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Don't see any questions right now. If anyone has a question, why don't you just unmute yourself?
This is Dave. Evan, maybe you could give an idea. I mean, for each of these projects, it involves you or your team visiting how many times typically?
Well, typically, in terms of the design and
Yeah.
construction, or just design?
Well, why don't you do both?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so typically we would do a kickoff meeting, with the lake partner, the lake association partner, and the landowner at the beginning. And maybe we'd overlap that visit with our data collection. So we'd actually, set up the whatever survey gear we wanted to set up that day and do that data collection after the meeting. So there's at least a visit there. There's often another visit with state or federal regulators. If, once we get to a level of design where we have enough information defined that we can speak to any, issues around the ordinary high water mark, or, any wetland related things. So there's another visit. And then typically, once we get the plans advanced far enough that we're getting close to a final design, I'd say there's at least another visit or two with the landowner to make sure we're all on the same page. So yeah, between concept and final design, maybe 3 or 4 visits. Construction, there could be, again, another 3 to 5 visits, depending on how complex the project is. Oftentimes, the Lake Association would like us there for both the pre-bid meeting. That's where we're showing the project to contractors who are interested, describing the project, making sure they're clear on what they're bidding on. Then once a contractor is picked to do the work, there's a pre-construction meeting where we stake out the project and, again, confirm with the contractor that, we're all on the same page with respect to the plans. And then during the work and for a final walkthrough, I'd say there might be another, 2 or 3 visits. So maybe even 5 or 6 visits during the construction phase as well.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Well, I have a question. I don't see any other questions, but I'll ask one. I'm wondering about the timing, like how long after the plan was done and then that this really got started? Because I assume there's some time between the end of the plan and getting funding put together. And then how
Sure.
long does it take to complete approximately? I know each one would be a little different, but just some
Yeah.
general ideas.
Yeah. It's a good question. I'd say probably, well, Dave, your group has implemented, I think, more projects than um, I would suspect any other lake association. So congrats. You've been staying on it. But so we did the LWAP for Lake Dunmore in 2020, I believe, or maybe we finished in 21.
Yeah, the fall of 21, I think, is when you finished.
Yeah. And then when you all wanted to pursue a couple projects right away, I think you got some enhanced or WUV funding in 2022. And a few projects were designed and implemented over the course of, actually, it was 2 years, partly because of a permitting issue on one of them, on the Branberry issue, kind of slowed us down. But I'd say, like, if you, once a lake association has decided to move a concept, site forward, and you have funding in hand and you have a consultant, within 12, certainly no more than 18 months, you should be able to get the project done, constructed. Obviously, we live in Vermont. It's a short construction window. We don't want to be pushing projects and disturbance around, especially around sensitive lake shores, much further than, say, right about now, mid or late October, because you just can't get good vegetation established this time of year. So better to be done, in September or early October at the latest. So that just, leaves us a 6 to 7 month window in Vermont to get these projects done. So.
Oh, thank you. That's helpful.
Question about the quar logs. How long do those last before they start degrading?
Yeah, it's a good question. It varies, like if they're underwater. So a lot of times they're designed to be right at the water interface, where some erosion exists. I think if they're underwater, they're going to biodegrade more slowly because they're in an anoxic, they're not, whatever critters are going to break them down. There are fewer because it's an anaerobic condition versus above the water. There are probably more bacteria and organisms that would break them down. But I've gone back to projects where we put coir logs in like 8-10 years ago, and they're still there. So they're breaking down really slowly. And like by the time they break down or start to break down, I think the idea is if you get a lot of plant roots established around them, those roots will kind of start to integrate into the biodegrading, mesh of that coir and really lock the whole bank in. That's the idea. But I actually, it's a good question. I don't know what others have been seeing for like long-term, decay on those.
Okay, thank you.
There's one more question in the chat. At what stage of the project, when is the historical assessment requirement addressed? And maybe Laura's going to talk about that. But Evan, I guess I don't know, which one of you?
You going to talk about that, Laura?
I will mention it.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, I'll mention it, but kind of just part of the design phase. So before you're ready to implement, you should have that information ready to go.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, Pat, I
Brent,
have,
go ahead.
yeah,
Mhm.
it's more of a comment than a question. Just on implementation, if you're doing work on public property, if it's owned by the town, I would just suggest, and Evan's familiar with this, that you bring in the public and inform them of what's going on, because we had a project that was on public land. And there was a lot of opposition to doing any work at this one particular area. So I think getting the public involved early really would help. We did not do that. They kind of came in late and we had to make some changes. But just like I said, just a comment as opposed to a question. I don't know, Evan, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think, yeah, I had your site in mind with that bullet about getting, people involved early. I wasn't necessarily thinking about the public, but yeah, when it's a town park property, um, the whole town is invested, and as we saw in your case.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. Evan showed the boat launch area, and we could have done a better job publicizing that as well. Once the project was completed, we got some complaints from folks who, lost shoreline where they could launch kayaks and canoes. And had we realized that at the start, we could have factored that into the design.
Interesting. Any other comments, questions? Thank you, Evan. Dave?
Yes, okay. Well, we're pretty much on schedule. Thanks, Evan. Next, I'd like to introduce Laura DeLugalecki. Within the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, Laura is the Lakes and Ponds Policy and Outreach Coordinator and is representing today numerous state agencies involved in the permitting of clean water projects. I'd like to use this opportunity to thank Laura for the important role she continues to play as part of FOVLAP's Events Committee, helping us sponsor events like this. Okay, Laura, thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Dave. All right.
Should be okay to share.
I'll share my screen. And all right. Can everybody see the full screen?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for having me today to talk about this broad topic of the state of Vermont permitting requirements. Today, my goal is to give you a sense of kind of the regulatory overview that could be involved in clean water projects or projects that come out of Lake Watershed Action Plans and what folks should be prepared for. This presentation is kind of brief because my goal is not to delve deeply into all the ins and outs of all these regulatory programs, but to kind of provide some general awareness of what types of review these projects might require, and also some federal considerations and resources and contacts and timelines to help you plan out that implementation phase of these projects. So any project that comes out of a Lake Watershed Action Plan or a stormwater plan, basin plan, anything similar, is most likely going to involve a protected resource. And whether that work is near water features like lakes or ponds and rivers and wetlands, or if that work is in some sort of specially designated area like a flood hazard zone, or impacts archaeological or historic sites, or located near important infrastructure like roads and culverts and dams. All of that kind of work on the landscape could come with certain restrictions on what time of year that work could be done, or it might require specific protections or practices, or may require permitting, or all of the above. So it kind of sounds like what I'm saying is when you have to think about environmental permitting is for everything, which is kind of true, but the good news is that for a lot of these projects that are funded with clean water funding or other state funding, there's a phase built into the design phase where the applicants for this funding or like consultant that you're working with, they're required to go through a permittability phase, and it's built into this funding process. And so they reach out to all the individual regulatory programs and say, hey, here are some of our preliminary designs. Is this something that could get a permit? Is this something that would we need to alter this in some way? So we kind of start before projects get going too far. We can start to look at the impacts to the natural resources, whether or not a permit would be required. And if a permit were required, is it likely it would receive one? So the good news is that's kind of baked in, and that's not necessarily left to just individuals. But sometimes there could be some self-funded projects or funding from non-state resources to implement these projects that might not have that permit regulatory check-in early in the process. So it's good to be thinking about it early in the process so you don't get too far down the line and design projects that maybe wouldn't have regulatory support. And one thing I like to tell people, just kind of a note about environmental permitting, I know that often these can feel like a paperwork exercise, but that I just want to say that these permit programs are in existence based on legislation and rules that have been adopted, and they're in place to balance the activities that we do on the landscape with protection and to ensure that the proper conditions are in place so that we can be protective of all these natural resources and public access and minimize impacts to natural resources in Vermont. So I was just going to highlight a few of the programs that are most likely to be relevant to Lake Watershed Action Plans and clean water funded projects. So first I have activities near lakes, obviously. This is where I work. I know the most about this area. But in the Lakes and Ponds program, we have two regulations that we work with most frequently. One is the Shoreland Protection Act, and that regulates development on the shoreland. And the other is lake encroachment, which regulates activities out in the lake. In my experience, most of these LWAP type projects don't deal with any kind of development. You're not typically building anything new or installing hardscapes, but that would need a shoreland permit. But mostly they're, activities like planting trees or installing infiltrative practices like rain gardens or bioswales or constructed wetlands. And those typically don't need a shoreland permit because they're not creating new impervious surface, they're not constructing a new permanent structure. They're typically being constructed in areas that are grass lawn, so they're not removing protected vegetation. But it's always good to check with us first just to ensure that there aren't any issues. And sometimes some protected vegetation might need to be altered in order to install an infiltrative practice. And so we can work with you to ensure that that's done properly. But through these LWAPs and through other types of clean water funding implementation, we do see a lot of shoreline stabilization projects, which involve either work in the water, using heavy machinery at the shoreline, installing rock material or the core logs, and those are activities that would need a lake encroachment permit. A lot of the clean water projects to address erosion occur on the tributaries to our lakes. They may involve altering a stream channel or adding riprap or rock to stabilize the channel. And these types of projects need review by a river management engineer, and they might need a permit. Additionally, there are areas designated as flood hazard areas, and adding material to those areas does require authorization and review. Same with culvert replacement type projects would need a review of a river management engineer. And then working near water often means that you could be impacting a wetland. Wetlands are all around us. Projects to address erosion near tributaries and roads often interact with wetlands. At stream crossings, culvert replacements, shoreline stabilization projects, these could all also be in designated wetlands. There's a lot of instances of overlap between multiple regulations. You know, I've been in situations where a culvert replacement project is reviewed by the Lakes and Ponds program, the Rivers program, and the Wetlands program. So there might be a lot of different sign-offs that are needed. Not every program may require a permit, but they might just need to review and be involved because they're part of their regulatory jurisdiction. So many regulations might have the authority to make a decision. Our programs are really used to working together in these situations, and we try not to give contradictory decisions. But sometimes a lot of eyes might need to be on a project. Another place outside of culvert replacement that often combines a lot of different of these regulatory jurisdictions is on road projects. Improvements and stabilization around roads have to do with how roads interact with surface waters. So those road improvement projects often interact with wetlands and rivers and sometimes lakes. And these projects would need a combination of resource review. And sometimes stabilization projects near lakes involve lake encroachment because you might have to remove vegetation on the slope to install some sort of tow and regrade the slope to protect the road. So all of that would need lake permitting as well. And then additionally, you know, depending on what type of road, if this is a town road, you might need local town approval. If it's a state highway, you need to work with VTrans. So there's often multiple layers involved. And then also kind of built into a lot of these projects are the DEC's coordination with the fisheries biologists in the Department of Fish and Wildlife. A lot of stream projects and culvert projects are reviewed by the fisheries biologists to ensure that the fish passage is maintained and improved. There are restrictions about when work like putting rock material or altering a channel or the lake bed can be done to be protective of spawning season. And these dates are different for streams versus lakes. And that's something that we would work with folks on through the permitting process to make sure they understand those time of year restrictions. We also have a really good understanding of where mapped, threatened, endangered, rare plant species, animal species are. So if we come into something like that, we would work with you to maybe alter the location of the project, or you know, sometimes locations can't be avoided and takings permits are issued through the Fish and Wildlife Department. And beyond these natural resource environmental kind of concerns, we also have our cultural resources. So sometimes these projects may require a review from the State Historic Preservation Office, also known as SHPO. They would, you know, if some of your projects may impact a historic bridge or dam, those are the most common scenarios I see. But I also have seen concerns about impacting archaeological resources. So if you're near a known archaeological site or a historic site, you might be required to have some of these additional reviews and assessments. And then also, I think it's kind of rare coming out of these types of projects, but if for some reason your project were to impact a dam, it may also need review from our dam safety program. But that's often a separate track, not usually these types of LWAP, erosion control type projects. And then beyond our state agencies. There are some federal regulations. Most commonly in these types of projects, it's the Army Corps of Engineers. The Army Corps of Engineers regulates surface waters, specifically any projects that put material in or takes material out of wetlands. So any impact to a wetland would need some sort of authorization from Army Corps. And also this is true for the placement of material in a lot of the streams across the state. And then specifically the placement of material in Lake Champlain and Lake Bomoseen, because these are considered federal navigable waters. Okay, so that was a whole bunch of regulations, and I'm sure that's very overwhelming to like the average landowner. How do we navigate all these different regulations? So I will say that a lot of the projects that come out of these LWAPs and other plans might not require any permitting at all. There's a lot of exemptions in these. Activities often like buffer planting or doing some sort of regrading a road. You're often working in areas that are already impacted, and you are just adding some sort of infiltrative practice or enhancing a site that they may not need a permit, but there are a lot of folks who get their eyes on this to make sure it's being done with the proper precautions put into place. Something may not need a permit, but you need to have a silt fence around the project area in order to prevent sediment from entering the lake or a stream. So there are a lot of exemptions, but just because all these regulatory programs exist doesn't mean you're going to need 25 permits for all these projects. And we at the Department of Environmental Conservation are here as a resource. Part of our job is to guide the public through these regulatory processes. So, one great thing is that if you are working with the state funding, there is this screening that kind of takes you through the process to help you reach out to the appropriate programs so that you know whether or not you would need a permit. We have an environmental assistance office, and their job is basically to help navigate people through the regulatory process. So there are a couple staff members there that is their whole job. And then there's an online resource, which I'll show you in just a moment, called the Permit Navigator, where you can put in an address and some basic information about your project, and it kind of guides you through questions to help you understand whether or not you need a permit. And then we have the Vermont Natural Resources Atlas, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. Here's Lake Elmore. And I'll just show you a couple things. I'm sure that, I'll start at the beginning here. So if you go to the quick tools on the side, you can zoom to a town or an address. So if I zoom to a town and type in Elmore, it'll take me there and say I want to zoom into Lake Elmore. I can start to see these red lines are all the parcels. And if I go over here to the layers, there's all kinds of information here. So if I were to go to the Watershed Management tab, I can see where the protected shoreland area is. So this is the 250 feet of protected shoreland where shoreland permitting is required. I can look at where the wetlands are. I'll zoom out just a moment. You can see where mapped wetlands are. Under rivers, I can see where flood hazard areas are. Fairly certain there's some mapped flood hazard areas. I can see where the dams are. Let's see, there's the dam right there. So there's a lot of information to help you. You can see where culverts are. There's a lot of information on here that can just give you some basic screening information to help you think about like, oh, well, there are some wetlands near here, or there is a flood hazard area. Again, we're always here to help. Let's see. Okay, I hope I'm back on my presentation so you all can see. Okay. here's just a screenshot of the Permit Navigator. And I just wanted to show, like, if you go to this Permit Navigator website, you answer some basic location questions, and then it starts to get to your project question. And they ask you specific questions about that pertain to these activities. And then at the end, they give you a little report that you could print out or save that basically says, okay, it sounds like your project is near a river. You should talk to this exact contact. So it kind of just helps you narrow down who you should be speaking to about these projects. And then as far as timelines go, it's a really good idea to have the permits in place before your project start date. Again, it's a really good idea to think about permitting, at least conceptually, while you're designing the projects. You know, within our watershed management division, it can take anywhere between a month and a half to 6 months to get some of these permits. So you do need to start thinking out and planning. And one of the reasons that some of the permits take a long time is that most of the state permits in Vermont are required to go on a 30-day public comment period. So that's kind of built into this timeline. And if projects are highly complex, they can take longer. Most of these LWAP implementation projects would not qualify as highly complex. But having this initial screening during the design phase really helps support the implementation process running smoothly, and we can help you with the permit process along the way. And that is all I've got.
Thank you, Laura.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to make a comment that probably, I don't think either of you were totally explicit about this, but generally speaking, the consultant is the one who does the permitting and takes care of a lot of that. And the main impact to the Lake Association or the NRCD that is managing the project is, I think, on scheduling more than anything else. And so I just wanted to make that clarification. I think I'm right about that.
Yeah, I think the figuring out the scheduling of when to apply, at what point, right, and knowing when the funding is secure to know the project's going forward. I would say that a lot of the permits are good for many years. So they could always be obtained early. However, they're often for quite a specific scope. So it's hard to get a permit that's just general in nature. Like, you kind of have to know what you're planning to do before you get the permit. So yeah, that timing piece, you know, there's a little bit of a dance there.
Laura, I know this isn't quite your area, and it may not often come into play in LWAPs, although it did at my lake for one of our projects, is the historical archaeological permit or review. And I mean, we were very surprised by it in terms of the location, but do you have any sense of, that's not always happened, not on all our projects, but this one in particular, they did for some reason. Is there, I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, I don't come up against it that often. I mean, we have projects in Lake Champlain, in the lake, that there's a lot of archaeological resources in Lake Champlain, old shipwrecks and things. And so that's where I often see it. But then there are known locations of like native Abenaki lakeshore historic sites that, yeah, I've only come up across it a few times. And, you know, there's only a very few folks across the state that do that work. So I know it can significantly slow things down.
Yes, which it did.
Yeah.
Took a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can add to it a little bit, I think. The state's, the Division of Historic Preservation, their model for assessing sensitivity is very much dependent on how close you are to water And this makes sense because Native Americans relied on water. So any clean water source, you know, be it a lake or a river, if you're in particular, what I've seen a lot, having coordinated with the DHP folks quite a bit, like if you're on a terrace above water, on a flat terrace above water, you know, that could have been a sort of an ideal encampment area, or, you know, what have you. This came up at Branberry State Park with a project with Lake Dunmore and Lake Association, one of the ones that I showed you on the screen. And that was just a known sensitive location based on past work unrelated to our project, you know, with that the state had done around the facilities at the park. So given that that was a known sensitive area, that triggered a review, a pretty in-depth review. And actually, when I mentioned we got slowed down, that was because of that. But in general, I'd say if you're, you know, unfortunately, a lot of our projects related to lakes are going to be flagged for potential sensitivity simply because it's right next to the lake. I think, you know, so ways that I've tried to not get our projects too tripped up with this is, and too slowed down, is trying to get someone from Division of Historic Preservation out to the site and to show them that early on, you know, in the design work, that, you know, look, this area is prior disturbed and we're only proposing to sort of like, you know, the equipment's just gonna temporarily track over it. We're not, you know, and we're only digging here, and there was clearly prior disturbance here. Like, if you can get them out, which, like Laura said, they are very busy, and there are very few people in that office, and they're covering the entire state. So, but if you can sort of prove that there's been prior disturbance in an area, again, an area that's not known to be sensitive already, you might be able to slide through a little more efficiently. That's been my experience, at least.
Other questions or comments? Anyone? Okay, well, we are just about out of time. I want to thank Laura. That was great and really helpful. And, you know, really the permitting people aren't scary, so call them. Right, Laura? We've
Right.
had, you know, those of us who have experienced it, I think can testify that they're really, really helpful. Thank you so much, Evan. That was great. And, you know, it's so interesting to see the plans and then to see, you know, to see them moving from the early design to actual implementation is super helpful. I want to thank the events committee, Jackie Sprague, our able chair of the events committee, Dave, Jan, Jerry, Deborah, of course, and of course, Laura DeLugalecki as our DEC liaison for that. I think I got everybody right. And I want to thank all of you for joining us. And I do want to mention before we leave that we have another webinar coming up, webinar number 6, Clean Water webinar number 6. And this is really looking at implementation successes and challenges. So it'll be a follow-up. It'll be a follow-up to this one. And that is going to be, actually, I don't think that's the right date. I think it's going to actually be December 11th. But we will have an announcement coming out probably within a day or two. And then I also want to remind everybody that the recording for this event will be on our website shortly. And there'll be an announcement coming out when it's up and available. So again, thank you, everybody, and we are adjourned.
Thank you.